They said the bishop kept no secrets, but beneath St. Mary's, a chamber waited, untouched for decades. Scrolls of confession, names erased from memory, sins too dark for the light. Whispers in the stone corridors spoke of voices that never left, of prayers that curdled into screams, and when the record was sealed, no one outside the cathedral would ever know what he hid, or why the church would bury it forever. The stone walls of St. Mary's Cathedral held the morning light in long, trembling strips. Dust motes floated lazily, catching the beams and scattering them across the cold, worn floor. The camera, if there had been one, would have lingered on the silence first, a stillness that carried history like a weight. Every pew, every arch, every carved figure seemed to exhale in tandem with the slow ticking of the clock high above the nave. The bishop moved through the cathedral like a man aware of eyes that weren't there. He carried a leather satchel, worn and creased, its weight both physical and symbolic. His fingers gripped the straps tighter as he passed rows of kneeling benches. His robe brushed softly against the stone, whispering in rhythm with the distant chime of the bell. No one spoke as he moved, but the clergy were aware of him. They shifted in their robes, eyes downcast, the occasional cough breaking the silence like a cracked bell. The junior priests noticed the set of his shoulders. He walked differently today, determined, almost predatory, in a way that felt unnatural in the quiet of morning prayer. But something wasn't right. A slight tremor passed through the cathedral, unnoticed by most, except the caretaker in the far sacristy. He paused, hand frozen on the brass doorknob, and glanced toward the nave. The bishop's shadow stretched unnaturally long across the polished stone floor. It moved faster than him. He spoke to the senior clergy, words low and deliberate. "Ensure it is sealed," he said. Nothing else, no explanation, only the weight of those words lingering like smoke. The priests nodded, their faces pale, voices swallowed by the cavernous space. Outside, the courtyard was washed in the first cold light of autumn. Leaves clung to the edges of the fountain, still wet from overnight dew. The sound of a pigeon's wing beating against the stone echoed faintly. Even in this mundane quiet, there was a tension that felt almost alive, crawling beneath the skin. The bishop returned to the altar chamber. He paused at the doorway, as though listening to the walls themselves, and that's when he heard it. A faint scratching, almost imperceptible, coming from below. He frowned but did not hesitate. Inside, the air was thick, the smell of candle smoke and damp stone pressing against him. His hands shook slightly as he set the satchel down on the floor. Inside, sealed documents waited, parchments tied with twine, each marked with the bishop's careful hand. He knelt, as though preparing to pray, but there was no reverence in his posture, only purpose, only calculation. Each document was inspected briefly, then stacked, then sealed again. The sound of paper brushing against paper echoed like a whisper through the chamber. A junior priest lingered just outside, uncertain whether to enter. The bishop's back was to him, and yet the figure seemed larger, more commanding than he had ever appeared. Something had shifted. The cathedral itself seemed to respond. A chill wind rolled down the aisle, rustling the robes of those standing near the pews. Candles flickered, their light bending and twisting. The walls, etched with centuries of devotion, reflected a subtle unease. The sacred space had become something else entirely, something waiting. The bishop rose, straightened, and turned toward the small group of priests now assembled. His voice was calm, measured. Everything must remain as it is. No one is to know, no one. He did not pause for questions. He did not allow protest. And in that silence, something fractured. The junior priest saw it then, the way the bishop's eyes lingered on the chamber door, as though measuring its weight, as though listening to the whispers within. There was fear there, but it was not his own. It belonged to something else. The day passed slowly. Each movement of the clergy was measured, mechanical, their duties performed with a newfound hesitation. Conversations were short, smiles were absent. The presence of the bishop, normally reassuring, now seemed oppressive. By afternoon, shadows had lengthened across the cathedral floor, stretching impossibly long, touching corners that no light reached. The air smelled faintly of iron, of something old and hidden. The satchel remained with the bishop, clutched against his chest as he walked from one side of the nave to the other, checking, counting, confirming. He spoke rarely. When he did, the words were brief, almost cryptic. "Do not fail me." And then, silence. It was a silence that grew heavy, that pressed against the eardrums and filled the space between stone columns and carved angels. The cathedral seemed to breathe, slow and deliberate, in rhythm with the bishop's own measured steps. Night approached, though the day had already grown dim in the high, narrow windows. The first flickers of lamplight appeared along the aisles. Candles were lit, shadows deepened. The clergy retreated, sensing a shift they could not articulate, and the bishop remained, a solitary figure in the vastness of stone and shadow, his satchel still in hand. No one left, no one spoke, and yet all could feel it. The cathedral had changed. Something had been set in motion, something that would not wait. And in the corner of the nave, unseen, the junior priest whispered to himself, uncertain if he spoke aloud or merely in thought, "Why does it feel alive?" The bishop paused at the altar once more. He knelt. He opened the satchel, and for the first time that day, a hint of dread crossed his face, because even he could hear it, the faint, relentless scratching, coming from below, and he knew that no prayer could stop what had been unearthed. The light in St. Mary's Cathedral shifted as if the building itself had moved. Dust floated like suspended time, settling on carved stone, on the polished wood of the pews. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the nave, elongating toward the altar. Silence pressed against the walls, thick and expectant. The bishop approached the altar with deliberate steps. The floor beneath him echoed softly. His hand rested on the carved wood, fingers tracing lines worn smooth by centuries of devotion. The congregation, absent today, had been replaced by emptiness, and in that emptiness, the cathedral seemed to hold its breath. He knelt briefly, a ritualized gesture of reverence, or perhaps habit. Then he rose, moving toward a section of the altar that appeared unremarkable. Candles along the sides flickered, sending brief shadows across the floor. The faint smell of wax mingled with old stone, with something older still, but something wasn't right. He pressed his hand against the stone panel, hidden behind a carved relief. There was a subtle give, a shift in the cold wall. He stepped back, took a breath, and then pressed again. The panel swung inward with a quiet metallic sigh. Behind it lay a small chamber, reinforced, narrow, and dark. Its walls were lined with shelves, each groaning under the weight of centuries of paper. Scrolls, bound journals, and loose parchments were stacked meticulously, each bundle tied with twine, each parchment marked with dates and initials. The smell of old paper was heavy, acrid, almost like the air of a tomb. The bishop entered the chamber, careful and measured. He closed the panel behind him, and the faint click of the lock echoed in the confined space. The flicker of candlelight cast shifting shadows across the walls, painting every surface with uneven strokes of amber and black. He reached for the first bundle, brushing dust from the top. The parchment crackled under his fingers. Names, dates, confessions, some ordinary, some deeply disturbing, were visible even in the dim light. Words of guilt, of fear, of secrecy, rituals performed in hidden chapels, confessions that implied more than mere human failing, and yet no one had seen them. No one outside this chamber could know. The bishop paused. His eyes traced the writing, lingering on a particular name. He muttered quietly, almost to himself, "It must remain sealed." His voice was soft, but the weight of the words filled the room. The chamber seemed to respond. Dust fell from the ceiling. A candle trembled on its holder. Shadows moved slightly, as if acknowledging the gravity of what was contained here. He moved along the shelves, selecting a bundle at random. Each scroll revealed a new depth of secrecy. Confessions that blurred the line between devotion and obsession. Journals written in meticulous hand, cataloging not sins but patterns. Patterns that suggested purpose, that suggested control, but he did not read them aloud. He did not share their contents. Only he was allowed this knowledge. Only he understood the implications. A faint sound reached his ears, a soft dragging scrape. He froze, listening. The chamber was supposed to be empty, and that's when he heard it. Footsteps, but not his own. Slow, deliberate. Outside the panel, beyond the altar. He turned, hand on the nearest scroll, but the chamber remained as it should, empty, still, silent. He exhaled, trying to convince himself it was nothing, yet the unease remained. Each bundle he examined seemed heavier, as though the weight of secrecy was pressing against him. Names of the faithful, names of the missing, names of the guilty, and alongside them, instructions, rituals, and markings that hinted at something darker than ordinary confession. He stacked the bundles, making sure they were in perfect order, tied each tightly, aligning them so nothing would be disturbed. The sound of twine tightening was sharp in the small space. The bishop moved methodically, carefully. One misstep could undo the work of decades. Outside the chamber, the cathedral remained silent. The candlelight from the nave barely reached the inner walls. Every echo seemed amplified, every creak of stone magnified, every creak of stone magnified. The space between breath and thought had narrowed, leaving only tension. He paused once more, glancing at the heaviest bundle. His fingers lingered on the parchment. A cold sense of responsibility pressed on him, not just for what was in the chamber, but for what it represented. The weight of truth, the weight of secrecy, the weight of control. The chamber seemed alive with expectation. Each scroll whispered its own history, each journal a silent witness.
The bishop straightened, shoulders tense. He understood the power held within these walls. He understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to leave unchecked. He reached for the lock, slowly, methodically. The sound of the metal latch closing echoed. Final, the panel swung back into place. The
altar resumed its unremarkable appearance. Candles flickered, shadows softened. The chamber had vanished once more behind stone and wood, but the weight remained. The bishop stepped back into the nave. His steps were quieter now, careful, measured. He glanced toward the corners of the cathedral, as though ensuring nothing had followed him. The silence was thick, pressing, complete, yet the unease persisted. The knowledge he carried could not be erased. It lingered in his hands, in his chest, in the very air he breathed. And in the faintest corner of the nave, a whisper seemed to breathe against the stone. "It is not done." He did not answer, but he knew it. The record chamber had spoken, and the cathedral would never be the same. The cathedral was a study in shadows. Night pressed against the stained glass, filtering the moonlight into fractured patterns on the stone floor. Dust, stirred by a careless draught, hung in the beams like tiny specters. Every arch, every column seemed to pulse with the hush of centuries. A junior priest moved quietly through the nave, candle in hand. His footsteps echoed against the polished stone, sharp in the quiet. He paused at the foot of the altar, sensing the weight of the cathedral settling around him. The air smelled faintly of wax and damp stone, with the tang of incense lingering in hidden corners. But something wasn't right. The first whisper reached him from the far side of the nave, almost imperceptible, soft, breathy. Words from decades past, prayers spoken in secrecy, confessions of sin. He froze. The candle trembled in his hand. He stepped forward, careful, listening. The words repeated themselves, over and over, as if the walls themselves had memorized every admission ever uttered here. "Forgive me, for I have sinned, and I cannot bear it alone." The junior priest's heart thudded. He scanned the shadows. No one was there. Nothing moved beyond the flicker of his candle. Yet the murmurs continued. Footsteps echoed in distant corridors, matching his own pace, or perhaps preceding it. And that's when he heard it, a dragging sound, low, intentional, moving from the sacristy along the aisle. The priest's throat went dry. He strained to see past the shadows. The candlelight only stretched the darkness, carving jagged edges across the stone. He tried to dismiss it, perhaps the wind, perhaps the settling of the old building, but the voices grew louder, more distinct, each confession sharper, names, dates, sins detailed with exacting clarity. The sound of guilt seemed embedded in the very mortar. He stepped toward the side aisle. The whispering followed, echoing from every angle, every corner. The cathedral had grown impossibly vast in the dark, each shadow a corridor of memory, each stone a witness. A faint flicker of movement caught his eye. A door previously unnoticed creaked just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness behind it. He approached, hand trembling slightly. The words whispered faster, layering atop one another, growing urgent, anxious, almost pleading. "Do you remember me? I was lost, and no one listened." He gripped the candle tighter. The light trembled across carved angels and kneeling saints. Their faces seemed colder, harder, as if judging him for witnessing what should never be seen. The hallway stretched endlessly. Every echo was distorted. Every footstep, real or imagined, multiplied. The stone itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each murmur, each repetition of a name long forgotten outside these walls. But he could not move backward. Something rooted him to the floor. The air thickened, pressing into his lungs. The faint smell of iron tinged with dust and old parchment filled the space. He turned another corner. Another series of echoes responded. A confession of theft, a cry for forgiveness, a prayer left unanswered. The cathedral had become a vessel for decades of guilt, compressed into a single, living memory. And then he realized, these weren't random. The voices aligned with the paths he walked. Each whisper anticipated him, guiding him deeper into corridors he hadn't known existed. The nave was no longer familiar. The pews, the arches, the side chapels, they were a labyrinth. He reached the central aisle. The murmurs swelled. Names he did not recognize intertwined with ones he had seen in the bishop's records. Sins unspoken, truths long hidden. Every confession carried a weight, pressing against his chest. He stumbled, catching himself on a carved column. The candlelight danced across a frieze of angels. One appeared to turn its head, face shadowed and accusatory. He shook his head. He was imagining it, of course, but the voices would not stop. They wrapped around him, tight and unyielding. He tried to focus, tried to separate the echoes from the stones. The sound of his own footsteps was now drowned out by the chorus of decades past, and yet, he continued, drawn forward, compelled. The sacred space felt profane. Hallowed halls were no longer comforting. They were accusing, condemning, suffocating. A distant chapel door rattled. The whispering intensified. Names he recognized from the records now called directly to him. A confessional booth creaked as though someone had just left it. But when he approached, it was empty. He knelt briefly to steady himself, candle in hand, heart hammering. He whispered a quiet prayer, but the air pressed in around him. The stone walls seemed to lean closer, enclosing him, and that's when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps following him, yet always a step behind, always just out of reach. He turned sharply. Nothing. Silence. Only shadows flickering. The murmurs resumed. They had names. They had intent. They had memory. By the time he reached the far side of the nave, the whispering had grown insistent. Each step was measured, each pause deliberate. The cathedral, once a place of sanctuary, now felt like a watchful chamber. He backed into a corner, candle shaking in his grip. The voices layered atop one another, creating a tide of confession that pressed against him. The air was thick, almost tactile. He could feel the weight of each sin, each name, each secret, and then he understood. The cathedral had not forgotten. It had never forgotten. He was not alone, and somewhere, beneath the arches, in the shadowed corridors, the walls themselves seemed to murmur directly to him. We remember everything. We never forget. A cold chill traced his spine. The candle guttered, the whispers surged, and the junior priest realized that the night had only just begun. The candlelight flickered across the rows of parchment, casting long, wavering shadows against the stone walls of the cathedral's hidden chamber. Dust rose from the stacks as though disturbed by some invisible hand. The air smelled of old paper, of ink long dried, of centuries pressed into secrecy. Every scroll seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as though aware of the eyes that scanned them. The bishop's hand hovered over the bundles, hesitating before selecting one. He untied the twine with deliberate care. Each knot seemed to whisper its own warning. The papers within were brittle, yellowed, their edges curled. The handwriting was precise, meticulous, almost obsessive. Each line contained confessions, small and large, but increasingly darker than any ordinary admission of sin. But something wasn't right. The first confession he read made him pause. A name he recognized, one that had vanished decades before, repeated across several documents. The sin described was impossible, if only in human terms. He leaned closer, tracing the letters with a trembling finger. Each line brought more unease, more weight pressing into his chest. The camera of memory, if one could call it that, seemed to zoom inward. Years of secrecy, of private admissions, stretched before him like a shadowed path. Some confessions spoke of moral failures. Others described acts so calculated, so precise, that they suggested a ritual behind them, a method, a pattern, a purpose beyond simple guilt. He flipped the scrolls with care. Names appeared repeatedly, each tied to a series of actions, confessions linked across decades. The missing, those whose lives vanished quietly, their disappearances never investigated, and that's when he heard it, a faint sound of scraping, somewhere deep in the cathedral. But the chamber was sealed. No one should be here. Nothing should move. The sound stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving only the scratching of candle wicks and the weight of inked words in the silence. He leaned against the shelf, letting the papers settle. His eyes moved quickly, compulsively. Each new document revealed another layer of obsession, sins that were repeated, measured, and catalogued. The bishop's mind registered it slowly. This was not merely record-keeping. This was devotion. Devotion to secrecy. Devotion to control. The scrolls detailed confessions of acts that seemed impossible to imagine, transgressions committed with precision, noted with ritualistic care. The names, the dates, the circumstances, they formed patterns. Each confession seemed to answer another, creating a web of hidden lives, of invisible judgment, of sins catalogued in meticulous detail. The air grew heavier. The shadows leaned closer. The candles flickered violently for a moment, then steadied. He could feel the weight of decades pressing in from every side. The walls themselves seemed to constrict, as though the building disapproved of human intrusion into its secrets. He paused at a journal, bound in cracked leather. It was thicker, older, and far more deliberate in its entries. Names of the missing appeared again and again, notes on their behavior, their whereabouts, their unrecorded sins. Some passages were illegible, their ink faded or smudged, but the intent was clear. Someone had been watching, someone had been cataloging lives.
The bishop's breath quickened. His fingers shook slightly as he turned another page. The ritualistic pattern became undeniable. Not every confession was merely personal. Some seemed to have been solicited, others orchestrated, carefully constructed, observed, recorded. He set the journal down, back pressing against the wall. Candlelight quivered across the shelves, catching the edges of stacked bundles like teeth in the darkness. A low thrum of tension filled the chamber. The weight of knowledge pressed into him from every side. The sense of obligation, secrecy, and the impossibility of accountability almost too heavy to bear. He glanced at a scroll marked decades earlier. The handwriting, careful, methodical, repeated a name over and over, tied to events that the public would never know. The unpunished, the lost, the unseen. Each confession reinforced the other, creating a lattice of secrecy that seemed to reach beyond this room, beyond the cathedral itself, and the realization settled in like a slow frost. The chamber was not merely a record of sins, it was a repository of control, a codex of obsession, each confession feeding the next, each secret reinforcing a purpose that could not be questioned and could not be ignored.
The flickering candlelight made the shadows shift. One shelf, one corner, seemed darker than the rest, absorbing the glow. The bishop leaned in, heart quickening. There, tied together, were records so old, so meticulously kept, that he felt their weight physically pressing on him. He could almost hear the whisper of each confession in the air around him, forming a chorus of silent accusation. His breathing slowed, deliberate, trying to steady the tremor in his hands. But the patterns were undeniable. The confessions, human sins, impossible acts, orchestrated disappearances, spoke of purpose, ritual, obsession. The cathedral was no longer merely a building. It was a vessel for hidden lives, a silent witness to acts long past but never forgotten. He closed the journal slowly. The smell of old leather and ink lingered, thick and oppressive. The candles flickered, shadows stretched, the walls seemed to press in. The chamber, silent and locked away, seemed almost alive in its quiet judgment, and in that moment, the bishop understood fully. Some knowledge was too heavy, some sins too deliberate, some confessions too damning to ever see the light of day. The weight of centuries pressed on him, and the chamber had spoken. He was not ready for what came next. The cathedral was empty now. Moonlight spilled through the tall stained glass windows, slicing the nave into shards of pale color. Dust hovered in the beams, moving like slow, restless spirits. Every carved angel, every ornate column, seemed to lean closer, listening. The bishop sat alone at the long oak table in the vestry. The journals were stacked before him, leather cracked and spines worn from decades of use. Candlelight flickered across the pages, illuminating words written in a deliberate, almost ritualistic hand. The air smelled of old ink and burning wax, mingling with the faint, sour scent of damp stone. He opened the first journal. Each line was meticulous. Dates, names, confessions repeated in precise form. Yet, with every entry, an obsession emerged. The bishop's devotion to penance had grown unnatural, methodical, consuming, but something wasn't right. Some confessions were ordinary, others were strange, nearly impossible, describing actions that demanded control over others, obedience, secrecy. Each journal entry was more than record-keeping. It was a map, a system of observation, of influence. The bishop had begun to tie morality to ritual, obedience to absolution. He paused, ran a finger along the margin. Symbols, carefully drawn, strange in design, appeared alongside names, arcs, loops, dots, and sigils. They repeated, consistent across journals spanning decades. An older order, one not spoken of openly. Their meaning was obscure, but their presence was undeniable. He leaned back, staring at the candlelight flickering against the wall. The symbols seemed to crawl in the corner of his vision. His mind traced patterns. Connections between confessions, disappearances, and penances became clear. The obsession had a structure, a purpose, and that's when he heard it. A quiet shuffling from the chapel, faint, indistinct. He froze, listening. The cathedral was meant to be empty. Every sound was amplified. Every echo carried weight. Footsteps, though deliberate, belonged to no one, yet they followed a rhythm he recognized. Ritualistic, deliberate. He returned to the journals. Each page revealed a deeper commitment to secrecy. The bishop's faith was bending, folding in on itself. His desire for absolution had eclipsed simple morality. Each confession catalogued, each sin recorded, became a stepping stone, a means to achieve a perfection that was dangerous in its intensity. The symbols on the parchment grew more elaborate, interwoven with Latin prayers, with meticulous charts of names, dates, and locations. Each pattern seemed designed to hold power. The bishop had become a scholar of sin, a keeper of secrets, a manipulator of absolution. He traced a symbol with his finger. His hand trembled. The lines were precise, elegant, but carried a weight, a responsibility that pressed into him like the cathedral itself. Each mark bound the confessions together, creating a lattice of control, obsession, and hidden purpose. The candlelight flickered, shadows shifted. He could almost feel the air pulse, as if the cathedral was aware of his thoughts. The journals were no longer inert, they were alive with intent. He turned another page, a confession, dated decades earlier, detailed acts so extreme, they bordered on the impossible. Names of the missing were recorded alongside instructions, rituals, penances, steps to ensure secrecy. The bishop's obsession with control was no longer theoretical, it had become tangible. He pressed a hand to his forehead. The smell of old ink and stone grew oppressive. Each breath carried the weight of centuries. Each page read added to the suffocating tension. The journals had become a mirror, a reflection of a faith twisted, and yet he could not look away, compelled, drawn deeper into the lattice he had helped construct. The candle guttered, throwing sudden darkness across the room. Shadows stretched unnaturally. The journals seemed to hum in response. He realized with a cold certainty that his obsession had isolated him. The cathedral no longer provided sanctuary. It was a chamber of calculation, of judgment, of relentless observation. His faith, once a guide, had become a prison. A faint scratching came from the floorboards beneath the vestry. The bishop froze. His eyes darted across the room, but the chamber was empty. The journals lay open, the symbols reflecting the flickering candlelight, intricate and hypnotic. He breathed slowly, deliberately, trying to regain composure, yet the knowledge pressed on him, every confession catalogued, every ritual documented, every symbol drawn. He had committed himself entirely to a path that few could understand. A path that demanded sacrifice, secrecy, and obedience to rules beyond ordinary morality. And then the unease shifted. He felt observed, not by men, not by colleagues, but by the order itself, by something older than the cathedral, older than the walls, encoded in every symbol, in every ritual, in every journal. The candle flickered again. Shadows danced. The bishop leaned forward, pressing his hands to the table. The descent had begun. He did not yet know the depth of it, but he would. Because once obsession had taken hold, it could not be undone. Moonlight poured through the narrow lancet windows, slicing the nave into bands of silver and shadow. Dust motes hovered in the beams, moving like tiny specters, disturbed by the faint, restless air. The cathedral's silence was brittle, holding its breath as if waiting. The clergy moved with caution that evening. Candles flickered in sconces along the walls, casting long, trembling shadows across stone and pew. Every footstep echoed too loudly, bouncing against the arches and vaults, emphasizing the emptiness. A chill pressed against their robes, a draft that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, but something wasn't right. Marks appeared overnight on the walls, scratches, darkened smudges, symbols that were half-formed, indecipherable. They seemed etched by hand, yet no one had been present. The junior priests whispered among themselves, voices hushed, as if even the air might overhear. Their eyes darted toward the altar, where the bishop had been seen pacing hours before, muttering words that made little sense. A visiting scholar arrived that evening, drawn by the cathedral's history. He carried only a satchel of notes and a flickering lantern. As he walked the nave, the shadows seemed to shift around him. The candlelight wavered, throwing uneven patterns on the stone floor. He paused, noticing how the air itself felt heavier, as though dense with memory, and that's when he saw it. In a corner near the sacristy, the bishop's reflection appeared in the polished marble, not as he was now, but as he had been years ago. A vision of obsession, of ritual, of madness. The scholar froze. The room seemed to expand and contract around him. The bishop knelt in shadow, repeating gestures from a time long past, ink-smudging parchments that no longer existed. Whispers followed him, soft, layered, impossible to trace. Names of the missing, confessions long forgotten, the sound of breath in empty corridors, footsteps echoing behind him. Yet he was alone. Every movement, every shadow seemed to carry intent. The scholar moved cautiously, trying to follow the vision, trying to map the distortion. Candles flickered violently. The air smelled of wax and damp stone, and faintly of something else, something iron-tinged, metallic, lingering in the corners. But he could not look away. On the walls, the marks multiplied,
darkening as if fed by the fear in the room. Symbols repeated, echoing those in the bishop's journals. The scholar felt the weight of centuries pressing down. The air hummed with the unspoken sins catalogued here, each one adding to the tension, each one amplifying the sense of unease. The bishop's past unfolded in fragmented visions, acts of penance that crossed into obsession, confessions coerced, disappearances unnoticed. The scholar saw the moral compass bend, snapping under the weight of secrecy. The cathedral was no longer merely stone and glass. It had become a vessel for obsession and guilt, for acts that could not be absolved by prayer alone. A cold draught swept down the nave, candles guttered, the marks on the wall seemed to writhe, imperceptibly. The scholar could feel them crawling across the stone, tracing shapes that the eye could not fully comprehend. And then he heard it, the subtle scratching beneath the floorboards, low and deliberate. It followed the rhythm of the visions, punctuating each revelation. He turned sharply, seeing nothing. The bishop was not present, no clergy were in the nave, yet the sound persisted, resonating through the stones. The scholar stepped closer to the altar. The air thickened, pressing in against his chest. He could feel the cathedral watching. The shadows lengthened unnaturally. The flicker of candlelight revealed half-seen forms, glimpses of figures kneeling, leaning, observing from the corners. He blinked, and they were gone. He noticed a scroll, misplaced on the floor, inked with symbols matching the wall marks. He reached down, hesitant, heart pounding. The writing was precise, almost obsessive, cataloging sins and penances with clinical care, names of the missing intertwined with rituals and instructions. It was a record of obsession, a map of the bishop's descent. The whispers became layered, overlapping, almost voices of the building itself. The scholar stumbled back, candle shaking in his hand. The floorboards groaned under the weight of unseen footsteps. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with the memories of sin and secrecy. He turned toward the sacristy. Shadows danced along the arches. The bishop's past, distorted through memory and guilt, pressed into the present. The scholar's breath caught. He understood. This was no ordinary place of worship. It had become a chamber for the obsessions of a man who had bent faith into ritual, morality into meticulous calculation. The candlelight faltered. Darkness pressed into the corners. The whispers surged.
And then the scholar realized the cathedral itself seemed to pulse with the bishop's obsession. Each mark, each shadow, each cold draught, a testament to a descent that had begun long before. He stepped back, heart hammering, the vision fading, but the weight remained. The walls, the shadows, the silent stones, they all remembered, and the cathedral, patient and waiting, had only just begun to show its face. The cathedral slept under a veil of moonlight. The arches rose like silent sentinels, and the stained glass fractured the night into shards of color. Dust floated in the air, disturbed only by a faint draught that moved like a living thing. Every surface seemed to listen, to wait. The former sacristan spoke quietly, voice low, eyes fixed on a distant corner of the room, his hands twisted in his lap, fingers restless. He recalled a night years ago, a memory etched into him like stone. The memory began with silence. The vast cathedral, empty except for the sounds of his own breathing, but something wasn't right. He saw the bishop descending into the hidden chamber. Midnight had passed. The air was colder here than anywhere else. Candlelight from the nave barely touched the steps leading down. The bishop moved deliberately, robes trailing, shadowed, chanting in a voice that was calm, steady, yet heavy with meaning. The words were soft, almost a warning. Some knowledge is too heavy for the living, and some sins demand silence. The sacristan froze at the sight. He had always known the bishop was meticulous, exacting, but this was different. Obsession had become ritual. Faith had warped into something structured, deliberate, and deeply unnerving. The bishop's voice echoed against the stone, carrying into corners where the light could not reach, touching every surface with an invisible weight, and that's when he heard it. The chamber seemed to hum in response. The sound of his own heart pounding filled the silence. Shadows shifted as if stirred by the chant, moving along the walls, pooling in corners, gathering into forms that seemed vaguely human. The air smelled faintly of wax, ink, and something older, an earthy metallic tang. The sacristan remembered the bishop's movements in minute detail, hands raised, tracing symbols in the air above the chamber floor. Head bowed, murmuring names, dates, confessions long buried. It was not a prayer. It was a performance, a ledger of guilt brought to life. He tried to step back, to turn away, but his feet felt rooted to the stone. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet something compelled him to watch, to bear witness. The bishop's voice had a cadence that drew him in, each syllable repeated, layering over the last, building a rhythm that was hypnotic, oppressive, unavoidable. The sacristan's eyes moved to the walls. The shadows seemed to thicken, stretching unnaturally, pressing against the carved angels and saints. Each figure in stone now seemed accusatory, as if aware of the ritual unfolding in their presence. He felt their gaze like cold hands on his back. The bishop paused, a breath, a glance upward, as if aware of the silent witness. Then the chant resumed, deeper, more deliberate, almost chanting through the walls themselves. The sacristan swallowed hard. The weight of what he was seeing pressed into him. Names of the missing, secrets catalogued for decades, rituals of penance that crossed every moral boundary. He remembered the final words, spoken slowly, deliberately. What must remain hidden, remains forever. The chamber door closed. The click of the lock reverberated in the still air. Candlelight trembled, shadows recoiling into the corners. Silence fell. The bishop had vanished. Only the echo of his voice lingered, carried in the stone, in the dust, in the memory of the sacristan. He fled then, nearly tripping on the steps, heart hammering. Each footstep echoed, as if the cathedral itself were aware of his flight. The chill followed him, brushing against his neck, threading through his robes. The air seemed to whisper with the remnants of what he had seen. He never spoke of it. Not fully, only fragments, whispers to trusted ears. The weight of that night remained. He could still feel it pressing against his chest, pressing into his thoughts. The hidden chamber, the chant, the shadows, they haunted him in quiet moments, and yet the memory was not just fear, it was understanding. The bishop's descent had revealed a truth. Some knowledge could not be shared. Some sins could not be absolved through confession. Some weight was too great for the living to bear. The sacristan leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. Candlelight trembled across his face. He could still see the shadows stretching across the walls, still hear the bishop's voice echoing in the stone, and in that moment, he understood something deeper. The cathedral was alive with memory. It remembered everything, and it would never forgive. The streets of Rome were quiet under a thick early morning haze. Cobblestones gleamed with the residue of rain, slick underfoot. The city moved in whispers, the occasional carriage, a muted bell from a distant church, the soft footfall of a lone passerby. In the distance, the Vatican rose like a sleeping giant, its stone walls massive, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The pale sun caught the domes and arches in a soft, almost indifferent glow. Every detail of the building seemed deliberate, cold, patient, stone and marble shaped into silent authority, commanding obedience even before a word was spoken. Inside, corridors stretched endlessly. Polished floors reflected the faint light, mirrored the high-vaulted ceilings, and carried each footstep like a cannon shot in the emptiness. Clerks moved in precise patterns, their motions efficient, rehearsed. Each gesture, each turn of a page, seemed choreographed to convey calm and competence. Yet beneath that veneer, an invisible pressure thrummed, an energy that was heavy, suffocating, almost alive. Reports had arrived weeks before. They were meticulous, detailed, damning. Documents and journals from St. Mary's Cathedral, accounts from priests, sacristans, and a visiting scholar, testimonies of ritualistic obsession, of confessions too precise, too orchestrated to be natural, names of the missing, records of acts that bent morality into shapes almost unrecognizable. Yet when the files reached the offices of the congregation, they vanished into a system designed to absorb scrutiny. They were logged, photocopied, and promptly lost. But something wasn't right. Requests for access became labyrinthine. Each investigator who attempted to follow the trail found themselves shuffled through a maze of offices. Politeness met each query, accompanied by precise, formal instructions, forms to fill, approvals to obtain, signatures required from clerics at levels beyond reach. Each step was a polite refusal, a delay, a subtle wall designed to tire the curious, to punish persistence with time and frustration. The scholar who had once walked the nave of St. Mary's understood immediately. The obstacles were deliberate. Letters disappeared. Phone calls were ignored or rerouted. Names and dates became redacted lines on documents, empty of meaning, sterilized of danger. Those who attempted to piece together the truth were met not with hostility, but with perfect polite evasion. The bureaucracy itself became a form of control, a suffocating silence that demanded obedience, and that's when he heard it. A voice, almost accidentally overheard in a corridor. Some matters are not for the living to judge. The speaker, a mid-level cleric, did not raise an eyebrow, did not pause. The words floated in the quiet hallway, a casual statement of principle, yet the weight behind them was unmistakable. It was warning and dismissal at once. Nothing more would be said. The files would be classified,
archived in vaults so secure that they might never be accessed again. The scholar walked those corridors, observing the mechanisms of denial. Doors locked automatically. Clerks moved in perfect synchronization, their hands poised over keyboards and paper, as if aware that even a misstep could draw attention. The offices were immaculate, almost antiseptic, stripped of personal idiosyncrasy. Each surface gleamed, every desk was devoid of clutter, and yet the silence was heavy, oppressive, almost conspiratorial. He tried to follow the chain of authority, attempting to trace the path of the lost files. Each step took him higher into the hierarchy. Forms signed, approvals sought, faces pleasant but inflexible. Every refusal was clothed in bureaucracy, dressed in the language of administration, but the intent was unmistakable. Stop digging. The institution would protect itself. The knowledge, the evidence, would remain hidden, and still the weight of the cathedral, of the bishop's journals, pressed on him. The scholar could almost feel it inside the Vatican walls. The memories of shadows and whispers, of confessions and ritualistic obsession, replayed in his mind. The documents he had glimpsed at St. Mary's were not mere evidence. They were a key to a horror that the Vatican had chosen to lock away. He remembered the first time he tried to speak to an archivist. The man was courteous, deferential. His hands moved over the files with care, and he nodded, listened to questions. Then, almost imperceptibly, the gaze hardened. "That matter has been resolved," he said. "No further action is required." The scholar pushed, asked for dates, references, copies. The archivist's hands paused over the pages. "I am afraid that is not possible. The files are not available." The scholar pressed further. A polite smile, a turn of the head. The files had disappeared. The labyrinth deepened. Another office, another clerk, another polite refusal. Each attempt to reconstruct events, to trace the bishop's descent and the cathedral's hidden chamber, was absorbed into silence. Red tape became a weapon. Every request bounced through levels of authority until it dissolved entirely. The scholar realized that the obstruction was systemic. It was not merely local. It extended to the very heart of the institution. But something wasn't right. He sensed it in the polished marble floors of the corridors, in the silence of the hallways, in the careful precision of clerks' movements. There was intention here. Every refusal, every delay, every redaction was deliberate. The weight of history, of authority, pressed upon him. The Vatican itself had decided that certain knowledge was too dangerous to share. The records of obsession, of ritual, of human lives catalogued in meticulous detail would remain hidden. He began to follow smaller threads. A casual remark by a low-ranking cleric, a hint of unease in a secretary's posture, a tone in an office that spoke volumes despite the words spoken. There were cracks in the facade, moments when the machinery of denial faltered for a heartbeat, revealing the human awareness of horror behind the procedures. But each crack was swiftly closed, each hesitation corrected, silence returned, orderly and absolute, and that's when he heard it again. Footsteps behind him, soft, deliberate, almost echoing the rhythm of the cathedral itself. He turned, but the hall was empty. The polish went.
Floors reflected only his own image, and yet he felt observed, not by an individual, but by the institution. The weight of centuries of secrecy pressed down, judging, correcting, controlling, each gesture of defiance. Every request for documents, every inquiry was registered, catalogued, deflected. He tried another approach. Letters, formal requests, petitions to higher authorities. Each one returned with annotations, redacted sections, notes in Latin, statements of closure. No irregularities found, they read. Clerical life continued without interruption. Any suggestion of misconduct was treated as rumor, as mistake, as human error. The system itself absorbed the truth and smoothed over its edges, leaving only calm, orderly surfaces. The scholar began to notice the rhythm of the denial. Files moved, disappeared, were refiled in deeper vaults. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking, sometimes gently, sometimes with subtle menace. Patterns emerged. The more pressing the evidence, the stronger the resistance. The higher the truth reached, the less it was permitted to emerge. Every investigation, every inquiry was absorbed into the institutional machine, and the machine did not fail. He walked the halls of St. Peter's late into the day, noting the geometric precision of every column, the symmetry of every arch. The polished marble reflected the light of chandeliers, but the warmth never reached him. The stone seemed to drink it, leaving only cold, silent authority. His steps echoed unnaturally, reminding him that here movement was observed, recorded, and managed. The documents he sought, the bishop's journals, the testimonies, the records of ritual and obsession remained sealed. Wax seals, embossed with insignia, prevented access. Papers marked archived were moved into vaults inaccessible to anyone without a rank far beyond the scholar's reach. Every effort to trace the truth was met with deflection, delay, or denial, and still he could feel the cathedral's memory pressing against him. The journals, the hidden chamber, the bishop's descent, all of it was real. Every name, every ritual, every shadow that had haunted St. Mary's was preserved, catalogued, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. The institution had decided that the cost of exposure was too great. The scholar began to understand the scope of complicity. This was not a matter of clerical incompetence. It was deliberate, methodical. The hierarchy itself had chosen silence. The knowledge of obsession, of disappearance, of ritual, of moral transgression, it would not leave the stone walls of the cathedral. It would not reach the world outside. And yet the weight remained. It pressed on the scholar's mind as he walked the empty corridors, as the sunlight through stained glass caught fragments of color on marble floors. He felt the eyes of the institution upon him, not visible, not human, but present. The corridors, the offices, the walls, they all seemed to watch. Each refusal, each redirected inquiry, each redacted file carried a lesson. Some truths are too heavy. Some sins cannot be confronted. Some horrors demand silence. The Vatican, as an institution, had chosen protection over revelation, preservation over justice, order over conscience. Outside, life continued. The city moved under sunlight and rain, indifferent. Pedestrians went about their day, unaware of the hidden horrors catalogued in secret vaults. The Tiber flowed silently, as if it too had been instructed to forget. Inside, the record remained sealed, and the scholar realized finally that some knowledge could not be unearthed without consequence. Some sins demanded the consent of the living to remain hidden. Some horrors required the complicity of every layer of authority. The weight of denial pressed like stone, and the cathedral's secrets, every confession, every ritual, every mark, every shadow remained patient, immovable, waiting. The record was sealed, and it would remain so for decades, perhaps centuries, until some future observer stumbled upon the walls, the corridors, the silence, and understood the immensity of what had been hidden. Moonlight spilled across the cathedral floor, fractured by the stained glass, painting the nave in broken shards of color. The air was still, yet thick, almost tactile, as if the building itself was breathing slowly, deliberately. The scent of old stone and candle wax hung in layers, heavy and persistent. Clergy moved cautiously, voices muted, footsteps hesitant. There was a wariness that had not been seen before. The cathedral no longer felt like a sanctuary. Every arch, every carved angel, every marble pillar seemed to watch, silent and judgmental. The walls carried history, memory, and a tension that pressed into the chest, but something wasn't right. Doors to the hidden chamber, once closed and silent, now pulsed faintly with light. Not harsh or garish, but soft, unsettling, as though the stone itself was aware of what it concealed. Shadows flickered across faces, elongating and bending, shifting in ways that seemed almost deliberate. The air thrummed with a quiet vibration, perceptible only to those who lingered too long. A priest approached the chamber cautiously, hands trembling over his rosary. He had heard rumors, dismissed them, laughed quietly at the notion of lingering spirits or cursed records. Yet as he drew near, the weight of unseen eyes pressed upon him, and a cold dread settled deep into his bones. And that's when he heard it. Whispered voices, indistinct at first, like the murmur of a distant congregation. Names repeated, confessions long forgotten, sins previously unseen. Each whisper layered over the next, building an incomprehensible chorus that seemed to originate from the chamber itself. The priest's breath caught. He tried to move away. The sound followed him, reverberating in the stone, pressing into his mind. Some clergy fled outright, disappearing down corridors, doors slamming behind them. Others crumpled, tears staining their robes, muttering prayers that had no end, no response. The cathedral, it seemed, was alive with judgment. A junior priest dared to approach the chamber, peering into its darkened interior. The floor glowed faintly. The walls reflected a light that had no source. It bathed the room in pale illumination, revealing scrolls and parchments strewn as though in ritual. Symbols scrawled across the surfaces, shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the walls themselves were communicating, instructing, reminding. The whispers grew louder, threading through the arches, through the stone, through the very air. Confessions that should never have been spoken filled the minds of those nearby. Guilt, terror, obsession, they became tangible, pressing on the body, the lungs, the heart. Faith fractured under the weight. Reality blurred, but something wasn't right. The bishop's journals, long locked away, seemed to pulse with memory. Names, dates, rituals, they flowed from parchment into perception. Clergy fell to their knees, clutching at their robes, crying out in hysteria. The chamber, the cathedral, even the shadows seemed to lean closer, observing the collapse.
The building itself was no longer just stone. It had become an instrument, a medium, a witness, and a judge. One priest, a survivor who would later recount the events, described the sensation as a suffocating presence. Every corner of the cathedral whispered in accusation. Every echo of footsteps or chant became layered with meaning, judgment, and dread. The light from the chamber cast no shadow, yet illuminated every detail of the soul, and that's when he heard it, the whisper of his own name, not a voice from another room, not a call from a fellow cleric. The cathedral itself seemed to know him, to know his sins, real or imagined. Panic surged. He turned, seeking a way out, but every exit seemed to stretch into a labyrinth. The light from the chamber followed. The whispers multiplied. The air thickened. The weight of history, of secrecy, of hidden sins pressed down with the weight of stone. Faith, once a shield, now crumbled. Rational thought failed. The cathedral's memory became his reality. There was no distinction between the building and the events that had unfolded within it. The past and present, the living and the departed, the moral and immoral, all merged into a single, suffocating experience. Some clergy succumbed entirely. They screamed, their voices lost amidst the echoes. Others fell silent, rigid, staring into the pale light, eyes wide and unseeing. Those who attempted to flee found corridors that seemed longer, ceilings that rose and fell, doors that led back to the same place. The cathedral had become a maze, a reflection of the bishop's obsession, a trap for all who remained. And that's when he heard it, the sound of the bishop's voice, recorded not in air but in memory, threading through the stone. Words of warning, words of confession, words that demanded recognition, reverence and fear. It was calm, it was deliberate, it was impossible to ignore. The chamber glowed brighter, though no source could be identified. Scrolls shifted, revealing fragments of ritual and record. The sins catalogued within, some ancient, some recent, were not only present, but tangible. The air itself seemed to remember, to carry the weight of guilt, to press into every breath, every heartbeat. Faith collapsed, minds fractured, reality blurred. The cathedral, silent and patient, observed. Every action, every hesitation, every gasp of terror became part of the record. The bishop's legacy had become a living curse, one that pressed into the living, leaving no corner of thought unscarred. The survivors would later speak in whispers, in fragments of what they had experienced. The sensation of being judged, not by men but by memory itself. The weight of secrets, of confessions, of ritualized obsession, pressing endlessly. The chamber's light, the whispers, the building itself, were no longer passive. They were active participants in a collapse that was inevitable once the hidden record had been seen. And then, as abruptly as it began, silence returned. The chamber dimmed, the whispers faded, light receded into the shadows. The cathedral stood still, stone and marble unbroken, yet the impression remained. Faith had been fractured, reality had been tested. The living could not escape the legacy of the bishop, nor the weight of centuries of concealed sin, and the witnesses understood, finally, that the cathedral was more than a building. It was memory, it was judgment, it was the vessel through which human obsession could persist beyond life itself. The collapse was complete, not in rubble or flame, but in the slow crushing weight of revelation. The light faded, the air grew still, but the memory, the curse, remained. The cathedral waited, and so did the sins. A pale dawn seeped through the tall narrow windows of St. Mary's Cathedral, catching dust motes that floated in the still air. The stone walls were cold, damp to the touch, and etched with centuries of shadow and light. Every arch, every carved figure seemed to watch, patient and unblinking. The cathedral breathed in silence. Investigators and historians arrived quietly, their footsteps muted against the polished stone floors. Cameras clicked softly, notebooks opened with careful precision. They moved with respect, aware of the history that had unfolded here, of the secrets that had been buried, sealed behind layers of stone and authority.
But something wasn't right. The chamber door, reinforced and locked for decades, lay in shadow, even from a distance. Its presence dominated the room. A cold draft seeped from the edges, carrying with it the faint scent of parchment and wax. The air was heavier here, thickened by time and the weight of concealed truths. One historian leaned closer, notebook poised. She traced the faint scratches on the doorframe, marks that hinted at years of use and secrecy. The patterns were meticulous, deliberate, a silent record of hands that had come before hers, of the bishop who had kept his obsession private, of the institution that had chosen to deny the world the truth. And that's when he heard it. A whisper, almost imperceptible, as though the stone itself were exhaling. Names, dates, fragments of confessions, remnants of ritual, tangled together. The sound carried no direction, no source, but it pressed into the ears, into the mind, shaping perception. Footsteps in empty corridors echoed unnaturally. Shadows shifted. Light bent in ways that seemed deliberate, almost knowing. The investigators documented everything meticulously. Cameras, audio recorders, journals, yet each person felt the same unease, the same pressing sense that they were being observed, not by one human presence, but by the cathedral itself, by history, by memory. It was as if the building had absorbed the bishop's obsession and carried it forward, a silent witness to horror. They examined fragments glimpsed through cracks, small gaps in the locking mechanism, parchments, edges yellowed, ink faded but deliberate, scribbled in the bishop's meticulous hand. The content was incomplete, disjointed, yet enough to hint at what had occurred. Confessions recorded not for absolution, but for secrecy. Rituals performed in isolation, tied to a philosophy of obedience and fear, but something wasn't right. Every attempt to linger, to peer deeper, seemed to draw attention. Shadows stretched across the floor like reaching hands. A sense of chronology bent unnaturally. Past and present felt fused. The investigators' own doubts, fears, and questions echoed back at them, amplified in the silent, observing space. The cathedral's walls carried memory like muscle, flexing it against those who dared to intrude, and that's when she heard it, a low hum, resonating through stone and air, almost musical in its subtlety. It was not sound in the ordinary sense, but vibration, perception, a pressure that made the skin crawl. Some names whispered among themselves, disjointed syllables, fragments of sins that could never be reconciled. The weight of decades pressed on their shoulders. Every historian, every investigator, felt the gravity of secrecy, the cost of institutional silence. Documents were glimpsed but could not be taken. The sealing wax remained intact, the heavy door locked and reinforced. Nothing tangible could be removed. Every record that the bishop had kept, every confession, every ritualistic observation, every hidden truth, the world could only know fragments. The record was sealed. They retraced their steps, moving carefully through the cathedral, noting every detail, the cold marble, the faint traces of candle wax in corners, the creak of doors, the subtle shift of air in empty corridors. The building was a silent repository of history, horror, and human frailty. It had absorbed everything. It remembered everything, and yet the door loomed, unbroken, as if daring them to try again. Outside, sunlight fell on the cobblestones, ordinary, mundane, indifferent. Life went on. The city continued under its own rhythms, unaware of the weight of truth behind stone and iron. Inside, the chamber remained a secret. The bishop's obsessions, the hidden rituals, the confessions recorded in ink and memory, safe from exposure. The cathedral exhaled, patient and unyielding. The investigators left with fragments, impressions, photographs, notes. Each carried a sense of unresolved tension, of dread that could not be articulated fully. The record itself was intact, a testament to secrecy, to the cost of silence, to the power of institutions that choose protection over truth. And some knowledge, they realized, was too heavy to bear. Some doors should never be opened. Some truths, no matter how tempting, are meant to remain locked away. The cathedral waited. The record remained sealed, and the weight of its secrets pressed silently, unending, on anyone who approached. Some records are sealed not to hide the truth, but to protect the living. What the bishop buried beneath St. Mary's may never be known, but the echoes remain,